Marcus Ellison was 39 years old when his mother-in-law handed him an apron and pointed him toward the kitchen like he was hired help at his own family gathering. He drove a 7-year-old Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a bumper sticker from a church he no longer attended. His wife, Claudette, told her people he worked in logistics, which was technically true the way an ocean is technically water. Her mother, Dolores, had never once looked him in the eye at full length. He was background furniture, useful, invisible, tolerated. That Saturday afternoon in their Decatur, Georgia backyard. 41 guests watched Marcus carry trays of food from the kitchen, while his mother-in-law directed traffic, and his wife refilled her own glass and laughed too loudly at jokes he wasn't included in. What none of them knew, what Claudette had never thought to ask in 6 years of marriage, was that Marcus held a controlling interest in 4 logistics companies, a regional freight corridor that moved product through 7 southeastern states, and a privately held real estate portfolio assessed the previous spring at just under $1.2 billion. He had spent 6 years being deliberately invisible. He had watched. He had documented. And when he finally stood in that kitchen doorway with a serving tray in his hands and saw his wife's mother mime to her guests, a universal gesture of dismissal, that small flicking motion that means nobody important, he decided that 3 weeks was exactly how long it would take to make sure every person at that party understood precisely who they had dismissed. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning of the party, Marcus had been awake before 5, as he was most mornings. He stood at the kitchen counter of their home on Whitfield Drive, a house that Claudette had chosen, in a neighborhood her mother approved of, purchased on what she believed was the combined weight of 2 modest incomes and a bank loan. The kitchen had been his project 3 years prior. He had laid the backsplash tile himself over 2 long weekends, pressing each piece into mortar with the same methodical care he brought to everything. The grout lines were perfect. They would be. He did not do imprecise work. He poured his coffee and stood at the window watching the dawn come up over the back fence. His grandmother, Eunice, had raised him in a small house in Memphis with a garden she tended like it was sacred, and she had told him once, in the particular way she had of wrapping wisdom inside something that sounded like ordinary conversation, "Marcus, the man who knows what he's worth never needs anyone else to say it first." He had been 14. He had not fully understood it then. He understood it completely now. He was what most people called quiet. His wife's family used other words. Boring, slow, safe, her mother Dolores had built a particular mythology around him. That Claudette had married down. That she had sacrificed proximity to ambition for the comfort of a dependable, unremarkable man. Claudette, for her part, had never directly agreed with that assessment. She had also never corrected it. He had met her 8 years ago at a freight conference in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he had been speaking on regional supply chain integration, and she had been working registration. She was bright, genuinely funny, and had a way of listening that felt like she was filing everything away. He had been drawn to that. He had not known then that she filed things away for different reasons than he did. The early years had been good. They had built something together, or so he had believed. She was warm in private, ambitious in a way she kept partially hidden, and she made him laugh at least twice a week through the first 3 years of their marriage. Then something shifted, gradually enough that he had not been able to identify the precise date, only the accumulation of small withdrawals. The laughter became less frequent. The warmth became occasional. She began spending more time with her mother. She began talking about money in ways that felt like reconnaissance rather than conversation. He had not confronted it. He was not a man who confronted things prematurely. That Friday evening before the party, he had noticed an envelope on the kitchen counter when he came home from the office, from an attorney's firm in Buckhead that he recognized but did not know. She had slipped it beneath a magazine, not quite hidden, but not visible unless you were the kind of man who noticed things. He did not open it. He took a photograph of it with his phone and went upstairs to change clothes. He did not sleep well that night. He was thinking about what the envelope meant and what it didn't yet mean. And he was thinking about the fact that he had been thinking about something like this for almost 4 months. Ever since a business associate of his named Harold had said at a dinner he was never supposed to know Marcus attended, "I didn't realize she was married to a logistics man. I thought he was just a courier." Someone had told Harold something. He had been wondering who and why and to what end. The party began at 2 in the afternoon. By 2:15, Dolores had handed him the apron. It was a deliberate gesture. She held it out with 2 fingers, as though offering something distasteful, and the half-dozen women standing nearby fell into the particular silence that precedes a performance they'd been waiting for. Marcus looked at it. He looked at his wife, who was already turned slightly away from him, reaching for a platter. He took the apron. He went inside. He served. He watched. What he observed over the next 3 hours was instructive. His wife worked the party with the practiced ease of a woman who had been planning it for longer than the invitations suggested. She moved from cluster to cluster with a particular kind of warm authority, the kind that signals to witnesses that she is the center of gravity in a room. He had seen her do this before. He had always admired it. What he had not noticed until now was the way she touched her mother's elbow before making any significant statement. A small, barely visible check-in. Like 2 people coordinating a story they'd rehearsed. By 4 o'clock, there were 41 people in the backyard, and Marcus was the only one working. His brother-in-law, Terence, sat in a lawn chair with a drink, and twice Marcus passed near enough to hear him say to another man, "Claudette keeps him around. He's useful." His hands didn't shake. His face remained perfectly calm. He set down a tray of deviled eggs and stepped inside and stood at the kitchen sink for 60 seconds, looking at the tile he had pressed into place with his own hands. And he made a decision the way he always made decisions, not in the heat of anything, but in the clear, cold space just past the heat. That evening, after the guests had gone and Claudette was on the phone with her mother, Marcus climbed the stairs to his home office, a room she had never paid particular attention to, largely because she found it boring, and he sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. He went first to a secure folder he kept under a business designation she would not recognize, and he reviewed 4 months of documentation he had been assembling with the same care he applied to every project of significance, quietly, completely, without gaps. The envelope he had photographed the night before was from a firm that specialized in asset protection and pre-divorce financial structuring. A contact of his had confirmed the firm's specialty in 3 minutes that same morning. He had not needed more than that. He went back further. He pulled up 6 months of joint account statements and cross-referenced dates. $7,200 had moved out in 11 separate transfers, each under $800, each made between the hours of 11 at night and 6 in the morning, when she knew he was asleep. The pattern was textbook, structured to avoid flags, spaced to appear organic. He was a man who had built freight corridors. He understood routing. He recognized deliberate architecture when he saw it. He had been planning this too, and he had been planning it longer. He picked up his private phone, the one registered to a business entity she didn't know existed, and he made 1 call. It rang twice. "Raymond," he said. "Go ahead and pull everything together." Raymond said, already in motion. Marcus closed his laptop and went downstairs and kissed his wife on the cheek before she could end her phone call, and she looked at him with an expression he had grown practiced at reading: mild surprise, faint guilt. Quickly recovered into warmth, and he told her he was going to check on the backyard. He went outside and stood in the dark for a moment with his coffee, looking at the table where 41 people had watched him carry food, and he felt something that was not anger and was not sadness and was not anything that required a name. It was closer to clarity. Some things required patience to build right. Some things required patience to take apart. Raymond Osai was 61 years old, a former federal prosecutor and a current partner at a firm that did not advertise, and he was the only attorney Marcus had used for personal matters in 14 years. He was not the kind of man who flinched at paperwork. He was not the kind of man who asked unnecessary questions. He reviewed the documentation Marcus brought him on Monday morning. The bank statements, the attorney's envelope, the photographs, the timeline Marcus had assembled, and 4 additional items Marcus produced from a second folder, and he was quiet for a long time before he looked up. "She's retained Whitfield and Carr," Raymond said. "I know, they don't do simple divorce work." "No," Marcus said. "They don't." Raymond pressed his lips together. He looked at the folder again. Then he looked at Marcus with the directness of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where people tried to hide what they were doing. "How long have you been structured?" "Since before I married her." Raymond nodded slowly. This was not surprise. This was confirmation. He slid a yellow legal pad across the desk and picked up his pen. "Then, let's talk about what she doesn't know, and how that changes everything she thinks she's about to do." It changed, as Raymond put it with characteristic brevity, quite a lot. The following Thursday, Marcus drove out to Conyers to see his Uncle Vernon, who was 74 years old, who had worked 40 years in commercial construction, and who had been the closest thing to a second father Marcus had known after his own father passed when Marcus was 11. Vernon lived on 2 acres with a shop he kept meticulously organized and a garden that would have made Eunice proud. He handed Marcus a glass of sweet tea and said nothing for a full minute after Marcus finished telling him what he'd found. "She had the look of her mother when I first met her," Vernon said finally. "You know what I mean by that." "I do now," Marcus said. Vernon set his own glass down. He looked out at the garden. "Eunice used to say a man spends the first half of his life building things and the second half learning which things were worth building." He looked at Marcus. "You're in the second half now." Marcus drove back to Atlanta with that sentence sitting quietly in the center of his chest. By the end of that week, Raymond's team had assembled what he called a comprehensive structural disclosure package. Every LLC, every trust, every holding company that stood between Marcus Ellison's name and the assets attached to it, laid out in a single document with full cross-references. What Claudette believed she was married to was a logistics manager with a modest salary, a 401, and a half-interest in a jointly titled house. What she was actually married to was a man whose great-grandmother had left him a single parcel of commercial land in Memphis, which he had sold at 24 to capitalize his first freight partnership, which he had built and sold by 31. Reinvested, expanded, restructured, and grown for 8 years before he had ever met Claudette at a registration table in Charlotte, North Carolina. She had never asked. Not once. Not how the F-150 was always maintained without visits to a shop. Not why the grocery bills were never a concern despite a salary that should have made them one. Not why, when she had mentioned 2 years ago that she wanted new hardwood floors in the living room, they had appeared 2 weeks later without a single conversation about cost. A man who paid attention to details noticed when someone didn't pay attention to him. Raymond also produced something Marcus had suspected, but not confirmed. Claudette's mother had been present at a meeting with Whitfield and Carr 6 months prior, listed on the intake documentation as a family consultant. Dolores had attended that meeting before Claudette had filed any paperwork, before any separation conversation had occurred in the household, before any of the 11 transfers had been made. The strategy had not originated with his wife. It had been designed for her. She was the instrument of it, not the architect. And that distinction, while it did not change the facts, did clarify the geometry of what had been built against him. There was one additional layer. Raymond's paralegal had pulled the public record on Dolores Fournier going back 11 years and found a pattern that Marcus recognized the way a structural engineer recognized a crack in a load-bearing wall. She had done this before. A first son-in-law, her eldest daughter's former husband, had been similarly maneuvered into what he believed was an equitable divorce proceeding, only to discover mid-process that his wife had transferred substantial joint assets to a separate account registered in Dolores's name 6 weeks prior. That case had settled quietly. The man had never fully recovered the funds. Dolores had walked away with her daughter, her reputation intact, and the working assumption of everyone around her that the husband had simply not been adequate. Marcus sat with that information for a long while. Then he added it to the folder. If the reckoning required it, Raymond would know when to use it. If it didn't, it would simply be part of the record. Documentation, the way all good records were, of what had actually happened and who had actually decided it. He went home that Friday evening and ate dinner with her. She had made shrimp and rice, which she knew he liked, and she sat across from him and asked about his week, and he told her it had been quiet, that the new freight contract was moving through review, that he had gone to see Vernon. She smiled and said she was glad, that Vernon always seemed to settle him. He smiled back and said that was true. He was watching her the way you watch load-bearing infrastructure, when you already know where the failure point is, not with malice, but with the precise attention of a man who understands that the order in which things come apart matters almost as much as the fact of their coming apart. Real power operated in quiet rooms. 3 weeks after the party, Claudette came home to find an attorney's letter, not from Whitfield and Carr, but from Raymond Osai's firm, waiting on the kitchen counter in the same spot where she had slid her own envelope under a magazine. Beside it was a sealed folder marked with a business designation she did not recognize. She called her mother before she opened anything. The mediation was held on a Wednesday morning in a conference room at Raymond's firm, 12 floors above Peachtree Street, with a view of the city that Claudette appeared not to notice. She arrived with her attorney and her mother, which Raymond had anticipated. Marcus arrived with Raymond and a man named Desmond Clark, who was his chief financial officer and who had worked with him for 11 years, and who carried a presentation case that he set down on the table without opening. Claudette's attorney opened by referencing the joint assets and the marital home and the equitable distribution standards applicable under Georgia law. He was professional and direct and entirely confident, the way attorneys were when they believed they had mapped the full terrain. Raymond let him finish. Then Raymond opened his own folder and slid across the table, one by one, 5 documents. A trust instrument dated 19 months before Marcus and Claudette's wedding. A corporate disclosure filing showing Marcus as controlling stakeholder in 3 freight companies, all predating the marriage. A private real estate portfolio summary. An independent appraisal, completed 6 weeks prior, placing the current total asset value at $1,240 million, not 1 cent of which had been commingled with marital funds, and every cent of which had been established documented, and legally protected before Claudette had signed her name to a single page. The room was not entirely silent. The ventilation system ran. Traffic moved on Peachtree Street below. But the only sound that registered was the soft sound of Claudette's attorney setting down his pen. Dolores, who had been sitting with the composed authority of a woman expecting to watch her daughter receive a settlement, said, "That can't be right." Desmond Clark opened the presentation case and removed a bound summary and placed it in front of Claudette without a word. Claudette looked at it. She looked at Marcus. For the first time in 6 years, he had her complete attention. "What is this?" she said. "Everything that was already mine," Marcus said, "before you decided what you thought I was worth." Her mother tried. She leaned forward with the particular energy of a woman who had spent her adult life winning rooms with force of personality. And she said something about love and commitment and the years Claudette had contributed to their life together. And she looked at Marcus with a kind of accusatory expectation, as if the correct response to a woman handing you a serving tray at your own family gathering was guilt at this moment. Raymond looked at Dolores with the calm of a man who had heard every variation of this argument in 41 years of legal practice. He said, simply, "Mrs. Fournier, you attended a strategy meeting at Whitfield and Carr in March of last year. You are on the intake documentation. Would you like me to enter that into the record now or wait?" Dolores closed her mouth. Claudette looked at her mother. Marcus stood. He gathered nothing because he had brought nothing that mattered into this room. He straightened his jacket. He looked at his wife, really looked at her, the way he had looked at her at a registration table in Charlotte 8 years ago, and he felt something close to sorrow, which was different from regret, and he recognized it and let it pass through him cleanly. "I'm not angry," he said. "I'm clear. Those are different things." He walked out. He did not look back. Behind him, the room was very quiet. He thought, riding the elevator down alone, of tile pressed into mortar, of a deck built board by board, of a grandmother's garden in Memphis, of all the things he had built with his hands over 40 years, and what any of them had ever actually been for. The elevator opened into the lobby. Morning light crossed the marble floor. He walked through it and out the door, and he did not stop moving. 14 months passed like water running under a bridge you've already crossed. Marcus bought land outside of Chattanooga, 23 acres with a creek running along the eastern edge, and a stand of hardwoods he had no intention of clearing. He had a house built there. Not large, but intentional, with a workshop attached that smelled of cedar and machine oil and something close to peace. He planted a Japanese maple near the front steps, which his grandmother would have approved of. He put in a kitchen garden in the late spring, and by August, the tomatoes had split at the seams with their own weight, heavy and unrestrained, the way things grew when they were left alone to become what they actually were. He had expanded his regional freight operation by acquiring a competitor's corridor network in the Carolinas, a transaction valued at $112 million that closed on a Tuesday with less fanfare than a grocery run. He had also established a foundation in his grandmother Eunice's name, funding vocational training programs in Memphis and Atlanta, which he visited twice a year, and which had, in its first year, placed 63 young men and women in skilled trades apprenticeships. He did not publicize this. That was not what it was for. He was seeing a woman named Renee Lawson, who was a civil engineer and who had asked him, on their second evening together, a question about freight corridor load distribution that had made him laugh with genuine surprise. The kind of laughter that came from being seen by someone who was actually paying attention. She was not a project. She was not a performance. She asked good questions, and she meant the answers she gave, and she did not perform warmth. She simply had it. The way some people simply knew how to listen. Claudette had settled. The terms were what the terms were when there is nothing to contest and no asset left unmarked. She had moved into an apartment in Midtown, was working in mid-tier marketing for a regional firm, and had, by account of a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it without any particular emphasis, stopped speaking to her mother. Dolores had not fared better. The social architecture she had spent years constructing, the circle of women and church associates and affiliated connections, had registered what happened in that conference room with the efficiency of people who had always respected outcomes more than loyalty. Several of her associations had quietly lapsed. Her son-in-law, whom she had pointed toward the kitchen with 2 fingers, had turned out to be a man with a billion-dollar empire and the particular patience of someone who had never needed to rush anything. Marcus heard about this through Raymond, who mentioned it briefly at a quarterly meeting and then moved on to other matters. Marcus noted it. He moved on. On a Saturday morning in October, with the light coming low through the hardwoods and the creak audible from the workshop, Marcus was pressing seedlings into the dark soil of a raised bed he had built from cedar boards he had milled himself. His hands were steady in the dirt. The coffee on the post nearby had gone cool. Renee was reading on the porch behind him, and once in a while he heard the low sound of a page turning. And he was grateful for it in a way that required no name. He thought of his grandmother. He thought of Vernon in his garden in Conyers. He thought of 41 people in a backyard on Whitfield Drive who had watched a man carry a tray and decided they knew exactly what he was. He pressed a seedling into the ground with 2 fingers and smoothed the soil around it with his palm. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.